Sit at a time. Come on.
Come on, if you're going to sit here, come over here and sit. Come on.
He's still deciding.
He says, I'm 16, I can do whatever.
Yeah, I want to do whatever I want. Okay. No, you don't want to go in that drawer. Come on, Judy. There.
I'm going to just date this, and it's going to be very informal conversation, and got some questions about your background, and then a lot of stuff about allied arts, and then some stuff about the present as well.
Okay.
And Tom is going to be part of it, so we can,
Tom will clearly be part
we
of
can
this.
ask him some questions.
That's it.
At least isn't a child saying, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, baby." Okay.
So this is Tuesday, September 8th, 2009. It's approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, and we are here with Mary Coney at her apartment on in Capitol Hill. So I'd just like to start with some background questions, and first of all, if you don't mind sharing the information, where were you born?
I was
And
born in
what was your date of birth?
Oh, I don't mind a bit. May 23rd, 1937, and I was born in Chicago. My father was a teacher in Chicago, and my parents lived there.
And what was your name at birth?
Kehoe, my last name was Kehoe, Kehoe, Mary Bridget, which is Irish.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and could you tell us a little bit about your family?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I had an older sister who is, I have two sisters, both of them now live also as well in Seattle, but I have an older sister who's just 17 months older, and then I have a younger sister, Jane, who is 7 years younger. And when I was a baby, we moved out to Downers Grove, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, kind of a upper middle class, Republican mainly, suburb. My parents were not Republicans. They were both teachers and Democrats, and so that's an interesting aspect probably of what goads me a little bit, probably still, Anyway, so I grew up in a suburb, and I went to the University of Wisconsin as an undergraduate. I had a scholarship there, so I could go. And I went there for 4 years from about 1955 to 59. And that was a good place to be in the late 50s. It would be a good place to be any time, but especially a good place to be in the late 50s because Madison was always an activist kind of place, as you may or may not know. And so I suppose some of my sense of, I don't know, partly a little sense of outrage, partly a little sense of, let's do things. And I was in student government at Wisconsin. And then Tom, come on over here, honey. So then I taught for a year and an English major, English and French. And then I got married to a man I had met at Wisconsin. And we went down to the University of Illinois in Champaign, Urbana, where he went to architecture school and I went to graduate school in English. And then later, about 4 years later, that's when I met Tom Wilson. And Tom's a big part of a lot of people's lives here in Seattle, as you may have gathered. But Tom I met because we had a mutual friend who I met through Tom when he was back visiting his family back in Champaign. They were farm family, and so Tom was, at the time, living in Port Townsend in Washington. And we became good friends, and he'd come back and visit once a year as folks. And so in 1963, my then husband and I drove out here to the West Coast thinking we'd settle maybe and possibly, and we wanted to visit Seattle, and we visited Port Townsend, which it was in August and it was just gorgeous. So on Discovery Bay, actually, where I now have property. And then went back, finished school. Then our marriage kind of went kaput. And I was a little bit at 6s and 7s after a couple of kind of efforts at making the marriage work. I was in San Francisco. I had given up my TA-ship. School had already started again at Illinois. I was a TA there. And so I came up to Port Townsend with an earlier cat. and came up with a few belongings, and came up to Port Townsend and stayed for about 5 months, which is a great place. Stayed on Discovery Bay at a cabin, and then I came to Seattle in June of that year, and which I don't know was 65, and finished graduate school up here, University of Washington. In the meantime, later I met my second husband, and we married and stayed here. Had a big house in Capitol Hill, which he is still in, an historic house, and that was part of it was a wonderful community. It was the first, and we were part of this. We, at some point, made it the first, and the only still, residential historic district. Harvard Highland District, I think it's called. Harvard Belmont District is what it's called. And there are a lot of historic houses there, and just maybe 3 blocks away as the crow flies, but it's very different there. So anyway, it's a beautiful neighborhood, and the sense of Seattle history was very embedded in the houses and the trees and everywhere. So I kind of sucked up all of that. I liked that a lot. And so anyway, it was through Tom, actually, who by that time had moved down here, or at some point in the 70s. And I met a lot of people through Tom. And Peggy Goldberg, Shirley Collins, just a lot of people. And in fact, I think it was through Tom that I was involved in Allied Arts, got involved in Allied Arts. And that was kind of my entree into Seattle and how I got to know people. Since my first husband was an architect, and the people we hung around with in Champaign graduate school were either English majors or art people or architects, and I spent a lot of time looking at architecture because of Ron, my first husband, here and in Europe. So I was very tuned into architecture, ideas, urban planning, Corbusier, a lot of that stuff. So it was a kind of a natural for me, and I've always been interested in that anyway, I think, but houses and neighborhoods. And so that was a kind of, I think, a predilection toward Allied Arts, joining Allied Arts, and then getting involved more into it. Okay, is that enough for that? That's more than you want to know, I bet.
When did you graduate from the University of Washington?
Well, I think I finally finished. I took a little time out to have one son, John, who's now 37, and I think he was born in 70. He'll be 38 this year. And I took a little time out between my exams and writing my thesis to have him, because I was getting on. And then I went back, finished my thesis, and then got my first job, which is supposed to be part-time at the University of Washington, in about 1976, 77. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I remember, actually, one thing that I remember is that Paul Schell wanted me to be the next president. He wanted me I can't remember if he wanted me the vice president, which then was a natural step at the time toward the presidency. And I hadn't finished. I really would wanted to do it because I liked working with Paul and I was involved. But I remember that my husband and I talked it over, and I really needed to finish my thesis. As you well know, thesis times runs a certain amount of years, and then you have to redo some of it. So I didn't want to do that. So I did not run that year for president. I waited till I finished my thesis, and then I did. So that's what, it was kind of. And I didn't really get a regular job for a while. Jobs were very hard, as they still continue to be. Until, I don't know, 76, 77, I finally landed this job. So it was a process of maybe, John was born in 70. I may have finished my thesis in 73 and then got a job in 76. So there's some nice time in there I had to devote to some things, And I, in the meantime, was getting to know the neighbors, neighborhood, some of the issues, fixing up the old house. It was the old Odie Fisher mansion, they used to call it. Odie was an entrepreneur of the turn of the century. And he built his house in 1909, which is a wonderful house, on Belmont Place East, on a kind of the end of the block up there. And then the carriage house was down below on Summit. And then at the time, one of the Bullitt family was living next door, a house that Odie had built for his parents, also another big brick Tudor house. And then when they sold it, Ibsen Nelson moved in. And you probably know of Ibsen Nelson. So, and his family moved into that house. So that was another added kind of connection that I had with architects, issues, Seattle, that kind of thing. So, and we were friends. Not close friends, but we were friends. Yeah.
When you got your job, you were teaching. Was that the job that you got? What were you teaching about?
Well, it was kind of a weird thing. There were no jobs in English anywhere. I mean, community colleges, everywhere I looked. And I wanted to do that, I guess. I wanted to do it at the time, I did. And so there was through a friend of a friend, there was a small department in the College of Engineering at the University of Washington called Humanistic Social Studies, which was kind of a educational experiment in the 1930s. Not a bad one, actually, but it had kind of run its time. And it was to provide engineers with a kind of a more, well, for one thing, a more convenient time courses so they could take them and fit it in between their lab times. But also kind of a more, more organic view of the humanities and literature and history and that kind of thing. And so the courses were really interdisciplinary, and it was really an interesting small department. I got hired to teach writing, which was always an aspect of that, and so I did, and it was just part-time. Well, as these things happen, it turned out to be full-time, and there were no other jobs, so I stayed, and eventually the department was kind of died its natural death. People retired, and then it was kind of reincarnated, partly because I spent a lot of time doing this, working on this, into something called Technical Communication Department. And we have recently rechanged our name one more time to Human-Centered Design and Engineering. I think this is the end. I mean, I can hardly remember the name of it. So it's a department which went from humanities and social studies into quite a very technical department now at the College of Engineering. But I was there, I taught writing. I was probably the most traditional professor there of the kind of new wave. I taught writing, editing, not too much editing, style, rhetorical theory as a graduate course. And so that's kind of what I did. And I was also at the university, this is an interesting thing, came much later than my involvement with Allied Arts, but about 5 years before I retired, maybe in 2000, I was elected chair of our faculty senate at the University of Washington, which was always a political thing. And one of the things, I did several things I was really quite pleased about, and one of them was to give faculty the right to unionize if they wanted to. Before, we needed to pass legislation down in Olympia to what they call enabling legislation. And before then, the president and the Board of Regents had been always opposed to this. But finally, because of a little fluke, I was able to get the president to agree to it, McCormick at the time. And so the University of Washington faculty can, if they wish to, immediately go into a union mode. They don't have to, but they can, I'm very proud of that, I think,
It's a big accomplishment.
It was a big accomplishment. And there were a few other things that have to do with people getting kind of notified during the tenure process how they were doing so they wouldn't get axed, especially for women and minorities behind the scenes. Not that you hope that happen, not that you think it might happen. Well, let's put it this way. We hope it doesn't happen, but it was nice, again, to make sure that people can see how their case is going and nothing unfair is being said about them. So we got that through too. So there were a number of things, and that was fun, And I guess partly being Irish and partly going to the University of Wisconsin, and I don't know. And my father, I know, ran for an office once. He didn't get it in our town, had to do the school board, but there was always kind of an activist mode in our family.
Well, speaking of activism,
okay.
You joined Allied Arts around 1970.
Was it? Okay.
Yes. At that point,
or at least maybe in the late 60s, because I was in that house in 1967, and I think it was earlier than that, Jeff, that I actually joined the organization.
That was a pretty activist period for
Yes,
Allied Arts.
it was really its high point, I think.
Could you talk a little bit about the organization at that point?
Yes, I can. I think. And not to one always compares, of course, but at the time, there was a lot to do in Seattle. a lot to do. There were some very good local people. Peggy Goldberg is a good example, and she lived in Bellevue at the time. But also, an awful lot of people came from the Midwest, Paul Shell, me, lots of people, or from other places, and saw this wonderful city which had not yet been ruined. You know, at that time, a lot of the cities were disgorged, the downtown, and they were building malls outside, and no one was downtown. You know, you could go to a lot of Midwestern cities and see that. And we wanted to make sure that, I mean, we said, oh, you've got this wonderful thing, don't ruin it by tearing things down and building new ugly stuff. And so I think there was a big impetus that came from people from other places. Now, Ibsen, I think, was local, and so I don't want to take, credit away from the local people, but there was a nice joining, I think, of people from especially Midwest and East, who anyway saw that there was this opportunity to save lots of things, and so plus there was really, people remember more than I do, but there was the opera, the symphony, all that came. There was one thing, was it the symphony maybe that existed first? But all those other art organizations were just very fledgling, just getting started, all the theaters. It was just a renaissance that occurred in the 60s, in the early 70s. And so some of it was very good, some of it was endangered, like let's tear down the market. And we had a very good, I think, Mayor Wes Ullman, at the time a Democrat, but that was a time of federal programs to, tear down rickety old things and build low-income housing, which is what he was going to do. And so the whole Pike Place market was going to go. And that was one of the things that Allied Arts did early was recognize, mainly by Victor Steinbrook, who you probably know about, professor at the University of Washington, architecture, who was just a pit bull, boy, he'd get a hold of something and he just would never let go. He even got a hold of me once on some issue and would let go, and we were on the same side. He was an amazing person. And he led the fight there, but it came out of Allied Arts and then later spun off into, when it needed its own organization of Save the Market. But at first it came out of Allied Arts, basically. And a lot of the people, Jerry Thone, of course, was active in that. I wasn't really active in Saving the Market so much as just a part of it, but that wasn't really my work. Also, Pioneer Square. Art Skolnick, who was he may have been the city architecture at the time. Art is a architect from Cicero, Illinois. Came out here, and young man, and was very active in really redoing and saving Pioneer Square, as I, was. So again, all of that was threatened, and so there was lots to do. I mean, that's one of the things that happened. There was lots to do, and lots of energy to do it with. It was just a coming together of, serendipitously, lots of people and forces that has really in a way never been since. Part of what's going on in Seattle since then, I think, and one could say, maybe to make a comparison, I don't keep up with it that much, but the Allied Arts of Seattle now has not been as successful, active, is because so much of it's been done. There was the Commons to do, and they didn't, I think, get on the right side of that one. They stalled on that one a little bit. There have been some things, and I don't want to take away from what people have done since, I think, what I would consider the heyday. But it was partly just that it was so much evident work to do. There was a lot of lawyers, Paul Silver, Paul Shell, Jerry Thone, Lou Pritchard. There were a lot of lawyers involved just in Allied Arts. And so we had a lot of legal help, all the time. We had a lot of architects, and then just good community, ordinary people like me, I guess, who were interested in this and thought it was a good cause. There wasn't anything more important to do at the time. Street trees, underground wiring, pulling down billboards, all these things. It was just one thing after another that came, and One of the things I think, Ray mentioned this to me yesterday, Ray Tufts, and I think her point was very well taken, is that part of what happened, there were so many things going on. It's like the first year of Obama's administration that needed to work, that we didn't do just one thing and then decide another. There were multiple things going on, and we did them all, and every meeting would be, we've got to do something about this. Did you know about this? And everyone, oh, no, we got to do something about this, which, it came one thing after another, and I think one at the same time. And it was very good that we didn't stop that. I mean, there was lots of energy going, and there were urban, we had an urban, I forget, affairs committee or something like that, which had more to do with government, and I think Paul was probably strongest in that, Paul Schell. But, there were architecture issues, there was, as I said, street tree issues, environmental issues. Very early on we were doing that stuff, So while there was kind of a helter-skelter atmosphere about it, it was also very exciting. There's always something new going on, and we were always down at City Hall, at the time. The mayors would all know us. We'd all know the mayors and the people that were, movers and shakers. And we had a few establishment people there. And by that I mean money people. And there was, from time to time, because we never had very much money. We were never very good about raising money, and our few efforts at raising money usually were a disaster. I was involved in one as president, which we'll talk about later if you want to. But we were never, because that is where our interest was. We weren't financial people. We weren't there for that kind of reason. We weren't there to have a big bankroll. We were there to do the right thing, and interesting as we saw it, and the right thing, and to be active, and really did not. Well, how should I put this? If people were offended because they were in some ways financially hurt by some of the actions that we took, that wasn't our main issue. We weren't there to please the establishment. It wasn't like boards are now, more fundraising boards, like the opera has and the symphony, and that's a very different kind of thing. There was always, in our case, from time to time, should we have our members have to give so much money a year? And I was very against that. I said, last thing we want is another board of people who have money, and have that be the criteria, because the most interesting people on a board were never wealthy people, some had money. Richard Steinbrück was a professor, he didn't have any money, and his wife was an actress, who's, I think, about her, she's Marjorie, wonderful woman. I think she's still alive, and she was, so the arts were very much a part of their lives, and but not money, and so that was, so we, I think that was also a big part of the kind of character of the organization, and we would have parties, and we would do funny things for parties. We didn't have lots of money to do things. Maybe I don't know if you talked to Peggy Goldberg yet, but she was always in on the party part. And we'd have annual dinners and at funny places. And I remember we had one time a dinner at a restaurant that a chef kind of had of some note at the time. But the restaurant hadn't opened yet, and so we were going to have our annual dinner with food there, and it really hadn't opened yet, and in fact there wasn't any wine for us, and so it was down in Pioneer Square area, and everyone was running out trying to find wine. The only wine we could buy was fortified wine in the stores down in Pioneer Square area, and trying to find like silverware and stuff. There was that kind of quality to it, which was always fun and always kind of in keeping with, I think, the nature of the character of the organization. Yeah.
Your cord is showing.
Oh, my cord is showing. Oh, my goodness. Good.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, before we talk about your presidency,
Mm-hmm.
and
If I can.
there are a couple of things I just wanted to ask you about. in those early to mid '70s years before you became president, and then I'd like to focus a lot on your presidency. But one of the things that I'd like to just get your take on are the presidents that came directly before you while you were involved with Allied Arts, and those would be Fred Bassetti and Paul Schell and Lou Pritchard. I'm just wondering if you could give me a little bit of a take on that.
Do you have those years to remind me? I know Paul was, I think...
He was 72, 73.
And I was what?
76, 77.
Yeah, okay.
And
who followed Paul Schell?
Paul was followed by Lou.
Uh-huh.
And Fred came right before Paul.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was Fred, Paul Schell, and then Lou Pritchard.
And then me?
And then you, yeah.
Okay, yeah. There was one term between Paul and me, yeah, I remember. Well, I don't remember Fred really well as president. I do kind of. I'm trying to think now through it. I think Fred is an immensely talented architect, by the way. The building I taught at the university on the engineering campus was a Fred Bassetti building, which really I always liked a lot, to be in Fred's building. You know, I don't remember much about what he did and what we did at the time, but except that some of the summary I did earlier, you know, he was, of course, very sympathetic to the market saving and all the street trees and all of that kind of effort. And as I recall, he was a good president, you know. I recall Paul probably better, just simply I was probably more active at the time. I hadn't just started. And Paul was very good. Paul was a very focused. He used his considerable energies I think talents as a lawyer, and he was in tax law, I think, as I recall, something odd like that. And I don't remember why he was so interested. We wouldn't think to see that was what a tax lawyer would be. But I may be wrong in that. Finance, I think, was his specialty. But for a lot of these guys, I think, and women, you know, this was more interesting thing they were doing in their lives than their actual paying jobs. You know, this was really fun. So that may have been true with him as well. Because, in fact, the work he did it led to the development of the Department of Community Development, was it? And then he left Allied Arts, and I think he became then, no, immediately, but then he became head of that department. So he moved from Allied Arts into a position in city government of some power, in a position that came out of Allied Arts, was created, you know, Department of Community Development, I think that was it. So that was I think he was probably stuck out more in my mind as being very effective. Lou, who's kind of a character, as you know, I think he was good. Lou's very smart and very quick, and Paul's not as voluble as Lou is. I mean, Paul is very kind of terse, and Lou is, of course, very talkative, and so every president, of course, brings their own character and personality to the job as well as what they want to work on. But they were good, you know. I mean, these are all in their own ways very good people, you know. A little bit daunting for me, but you know, I had a good time. I stepped up, and then I guess I was the first woman president, which, looking back now, doesn't seem much, and I didn't think too much about it. But at the time, you know, I suppose it was, you know. And there are a number of times I've been the first woman for different things. So, you know, somehow that didn't seem that unusual at the time, maybe, but. And you know, it's funny. I can't remember. You maybe remember better what I worked on than I do. These are all 2-year terms at the time. Most of the time, people did do 2 years. Later, some of the people slipped into a 1-year term, which I think was a shame. I think you need at least 2 years. I think 2 years is about right. You know, you got to get up to speed, and then really can work on some real projects and can see them through. It usually takes more than 1 year to do. And then after 2 years, you get a little burnt out and need to go back to your job and your family a little bit. But So maybe you have some.
Yeah, I have a whole.
Oh, okay, all right. You can go into that. Do you want anything else about
Yeah, one thing I want.
presidents?
Again, before you became president, a couple of things happened, and I just want to get your take on them. One was, and these are things that you worked on before you became president.
Oh,
One
okay.
was this very exciting increase in the Seattle Arts Commission
Right.
budget that you
Right.
worked on.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Was that the one I did with Lloyd Junker and Peter
I
Donnelly?
believe so. It was
And
the
Ann Folk?
Municipal Arts Support Committee. And
You know, isn't that funny? I can't remember the name of that. All I know is that one summer, I think in particular it was the summer, Ann Folk, who at the time had the Andor Gallery. Do you know Ann Folk's name as a person? Ann Folk, it was over here on Capitol Hill on maybe 11th or 12th or so, and an alternative, interesting gallery at the time. And Lloyd Junker, who was the basically development officer or fundraiser for the opera, and Peter Donnelly, who went on to great fame here in the city of Seattle, but at the time he was the fundraiser, I think, for the what is now the Bagley Wright Theater and the Seattle Repertory Theater, and me, and that's what we worked on in the summer. I remember we met at Ann's, I think that's what it was. We met at Ann's gallery once a week at least, and spent 3 or 4 hours a night, once a week doing that. Yeah, working on that act. Yeah, for money, for funding. Yeah.
and it was very successful.
Yes, it was. Right. So, yeah, those are good things to have done. You kind of forget about them, but they are good things to have done, yeah.
There was also something that you worked on, you were on the mayor's zoo task force.
Oh, yes, that's a very funny story.
Yeah,
I'll tell you about that story.
that would be
It was a good
interesting.
story. Makes me smile. At our carriage house on Summit, right next to our carriage house, is an old Seattle kind of a Dutch colonial. George Barthlick lived and had his architecture office, and George Barthlick was an architect and had gotten the contract from the city, I think, to do a design for the zoo. And there had been a big a big initiative called Forward Thrust in the earlier 60s, which is money to spend in the city. And Forward Thrust was a big thing. If you don't know about that, it's worth looking into. And there was money for zoo renovation, and the zoo was just a little old place, and famous gorilla was in a concrete box. I mean, it was pretty, crude. And not much was known about what we know now about and think about animals in zoo situations. But it was people, kids, so kids could go. And I remember we had a dog, and we'd go to the zoo and with the dog. Well, of course, now you'd never do anything like that. But anyway, so the Mayor Ullman had this money for, and George Barthlick came up with a plan, the zoo plan. Across the street from where George lived, across from our carriage house, there was a fellow named Larry Olin, who is a very famous now landscape architect. And he worked on the zoo plan. And then he left because he got a prix de Rome, as I remember. And in his place, an English architect named David Hancock's came over and lived in the little place. It was Miss Jackie's house, that we called it at the time, little tiny house, cute house. So there was our carriage house, and George Barthlick's studio, and then across the street was Laurie, and then David Hancock and his wife. Well, I'd be down below on where the carriage house was. Sometimes they were making leaves, and David Hancock and I became good friends. And he's a very funny person and witty, and I like that, and he liked me. So we get to be good friends. And David was always a little critical of the Barthlick thing, a little bit, I knew. And in fact, he finally left, I think, slightly out of disgust at it being a little bit too ambitious. And in fact, it was. The city voted it down because the plan was to cover Aurora Avenue over, make that into an aviary, and spill the zoo even further east, eating up those soccer fields down below where they are now in Woodland Park, So it was a huge project. It was just the city, the citizens just decided that it was just way too much, and so it was voted down, the plan. Well, here we had this problem that we had all this money been spent on planning. George was, I don't know where he was out of it by that time because his plan was defeated. And the mayor had, had got to come up with something. What am I going to do now? And because he still had this money dedicated to do something about the zoo, but no plan. So he formed a committee. Now, I don't know why he put me on the committee. Maybe George said something or something. He formed mayor's committee. And I was on that committee. And I remember one of the first meetings, I said, well, I'll tell you can really cut to the chase here, is just bring David Hancock back, because he worked in the original plan. He has a lot of ideas. I'm just talking to him informally, as I did on our street. David had a lot of interesting ideas about, what zoos should become. And rather than start all over again, why don't we just bring David here? So we did. And that's how David Hancock came back, became then head of the zoo plan. And then he really designed and was the genius behind the zoo. And David was interesting. He went to the University of Bristol, as I recall, and he decided that before he could build houses for people, that he needed to know more about kind of housing and what it was all about. So he studied animal housing first, as a step toward human housing, and then he never got beyond that. He really stayed with animals. So he was very interested in animal housing and what was humane, and really expanded the idea of zoos instead of just being places for kids to see odd and exotic animals. This was at the time also coming in. The zoos need to be used for animal preservation, and for something more important than just viewing animals. So he was under David Towns, who at the time was head of the Parks Department. The zoo was under the Parks Department. And maybe I knew David first. I can't remember. But at any rate, who was very good, I thought, head of the Park Department. And so the original planning and all of that was done under David Hancock, who... So it was just, again, a serendipitous thing that he happened to be a neighbor, and I, met him and talked to him and liked him and thought, let's. So it just really worked out perfectly. David never really liked just ordinary administration. I mean, he's a design thinker. He's written books. He's a very, very creative person. Can be abrasive because he has very strong ideas about things, but, I always think he's right on it. In fact, on the current issue, I agree with David. Even though it angers a lot of people, David doesn't feel that elephants should be in zoos, that they need to be in a much bigger environment, and that zoos should give up their elephants, and that they're the kind of animals who need a lot more space, and I know he's been in conflict with the local zoo here about that. He lives in Melbourne now, Australia, and it kind of said, I know. There was a lot of conflict about that, but I tend to agree with David about that. I think he's very good about his views on animals and housing.
So was that a successful effort, the task force?
Oh yes, it was absolutely. Yeah, it was one of the great, I think, successes, and I don't want to take too much credit for it. The main thing I just said, get David Hancock over here, and we don't have to. You don't have to start afresh. You can pick up everything that was good in the Bartholic plan, because there was a lot of good stuff that was done, and move on though in a new and fresh way. So that's Oh yes, absolutely. The interesting thing is that after a while, David got kind of bored and needed to move on, and just became to administration. So then. David Towns moved over from the park department as being head of the zoo, the park department, and he became then director of the zoo for many years. And David's genius is organization. He wasn't an animal person particularly or anything, but he's a master organizer. And he's now retired, but he actually now consults down at the Sonoma Desert Museum, where David actually was the director for a while, and now David Towns has been down there. So, it's not very many generations back before that whole thing happened. And that was fun. I hadn't thought about that, but that was Jeff. But that was a really, really good thing that happened. Yeah. So, and Seattle now is one of the leading zoos in the country in terms of its attitude about animals, how it handles animals, and breeding, and compounds. There's some. Can I tell you a funny story? Do you have time for a funny story? We were living in London one year in 1980 to 81, and David was still director of the zoo, and he was home at Christmas. Went back to England to visit his family, and stayed with us over Christmas, as I remember, and we had a great time. And he actually found England quite stultifying for him, and he said it was like being in jail, because he didn't go to Cambridge or Oxford. So he loved hanging out with us, and we liked David a lot. And he told several funny stories that had been going on. One of the funny stories was about, they in this new gorilla compound that they had never been done before. They wanted to have a natural view of the gorilla life rather than behind cages. That they had these deep pits. They were really just pits that the gorillas would be in, and then the humans, you'd look over, and it would seem as if there was no distance between you and the gorillas. But in fact, there was this big pit. So to test it out, whether the pit would work, they hired a rock climber who went in there to try and climb out of the pit. And when the rock climber tried, I think for about 7 hours, couldn't, so they said, okay. So they decided they'd move in the gorillas. Well, slowly the gorillas moved in, because some of them were very cautious, because they had never been outside. They came out from underneath their cages and these concrete awful things they lived in. And anyway, they came out pretty soon. And so this was very successful, and people were, looking at the gorillas as if they were in real life situations. And there were trees and rocks and all those naturalistic things. But the trouble was, it was so realistic that a lot of times it was kind of like, is this gorilla out or not out? And so when David was sat in his office, a number of times there'd be a report, a gorilla's out, and it wouldn't be. So one day to his office, and some guy came in, he said, a visitor, he said, the gorilla's out of his cage, or out of his compound. And David said, well, not really, he said. And then he explained, about all this kind of visual perception, and the guy listened to him. And then he started to walk away and go. He said, but he's sitting on a park bench. And David said, oh, shit. He ran out. And indeed, this huge gorilla, kind of a young guy, was sitting on a bench like this. And, everyone was kind of looking around, and no one knew what to do. And they tried to, of course, coax him back, and they wouldn't go. So they finally tranquilized him and got him back in. And it turned out he'd broken off a branch of a tree and climbed out, and there he was. So that was a great story. David, he's a very funny person, lots of funny stories. That was one of the good ones. Okay. That was an aside, wasn't it?
Well, speaking of trees, since we mentioned the gorillas.
Street trees, yeah.
Street trees.
I do know a street tree.
That was another big
it was. At our kitchen window, lovely window, it was kind of like this, that looked straight up East Prospect, right here in this neighborhood. And I was pregnant at the time, therefore I was home. I remember it was spring, I think, early spring or sometime in. Well, I'll tell you when it was. It was 1970, because that's when John was born, in the fall. And I was at the kitchen sink, and all of a sudden, it was about, 10:30 in the morning, I heard this awful racket. And up our street, up East Prospect, were these wonderful old, huge trees, street trees. And the city light was cutting them, just at the top of them off. And I ran outside and stopped, well, little lady, what do you. So I called my husband and said, all right, we got to do something about this. I said, they're cutting down our street trees, ruining our street. They weren't actually on our property. They were on Kay Bullett's property, which is up from the side along East Prospect and Harvard. But I didn't, we needed to do something then. So he got a stop work order. And by noon, called off the cutters. And I remember that, a judge came out later, and people were looking, and there was a press there to see these street trees, which were huge, and they're still there, by the way, some of them. But like a lot of these trees, what the City Light gave them what they call a 5-year clearance, which means you cut the tops off so they won't have to come back for 5 years to clear for the wires. Well, when you do that to a tree, you just wreck it because it loses its balance and it's, and then you get these little silly shoots coming out and this big trunk, and it was just, and so the outcome of that was that the biggest thing is the city light, which is unfortunately because the street trees are on the area that City Light handles, which is the overhead wires, and so they had jurisdictions over street trees. It was their job to keep the wires clear and safe. You see, so the street trees was secondary to them, and so we had the city hire an arborist, and the arborist worked for City Light, worked for the city, and it was always there to oversee the clearance, so that they didn't decimate these. Well, decimate's not the right word. Ruin these trees. And I don't know. I haven't kept up with it. I don't know how. I can tell when you see trees tunneled now. Or they're going like this. That's because of this. This effort that they could no longer be just topped like that. Although sometimes I think there are a lot of crews out. My guess is that don't have an arborist with them, checking on them. But it was a big change, I think, at that time. And then planting street trees too, which was a big thing, And of course there was a tension between City Light and didn't want any trees anywhere because they bothered with the wires, And so that was another kind of success we had. Yeah. Yeah.
And that was through Allied Arts?
Yes, yes, that I worked, yeah. Well, first of all, just as a citizen, and then through my former husband, and that was where lawyers can really, what could I have done? Nothing. They would have just, the workers just, but when you get a lawyer to go down and file a stop work, by noon the whole thing has come to a halt, an hour and a half. And so so it wasn't just the, lawyers inside, but other lawyers got roped into, people were, Allied Arts, I think at the time, were always willing to pull people in on special things because they had talent or pull in a certain way, and we were pretty shameless about it because we thought the issue was so important, so that's another example, right? I don't know when that happened. That was before I was president. That was 1970, yeah, exactly.
Now, in terms of your presidency,
okay.
Do we have some, how are we doing for time?
15 minutes.
In terms of your presidency, how I know that you mentioned that you were probably approached by Paul Shell to become president.
Yeah.
What happened? What actually led up to you becoming president following Lou Pritchard? Who approached you about that?
Well, I think it was just that I had agreed that I needed to finish my thesis, and so that therefore Lou stepped in, and then it was kind of understood that I would step in next. Yeah. That's how that worked.
And what was the feeling like? This was kind of a landmark presidency. You were the first woman president of Allied Arts, the first female president. Did you meet with any resistance at all?
No. Okay. No, I really didn't. No, I didn't. Maybe it was partly that just me, but my personality. But I remember I was in graduate school at Illinois, believe it or not, and even in English, which is more traditional female kind of place. But in the English department at the University of Illinois, there was a lot of bias against women. I'm embarrassed to say. Not at Wisconsin when I was an undergraduate, but there's a big difference politically between the University of Wisconsin and the University of Illinois at that time, especially. And I remember I had a lot of prejudice against fellow graduate students. What are you doing here? You're taking some male's place. Why? So, I was a little used to that, and and besides, I have to say, I want to give my former husband a lot of credit. Byron. He was supportive. He was very supportive. I mean, he wasn't threatened by my doing things. It was fine. and bemused sometimes maybe. But Byron had his own activism. He was very active in KRAB, which was an alternative radio station here at the time, that Peggy Goldberg was also involved in, by the way. So, and I must say, I think if I'd been a single woman, I hate to say this, but if I'd been a single woman at the time, I might not have felt quite as willing or able to take on some of these fights, you know. But it's kind of like the street tree example. You know, I could call Byron and say, you know, do something. What are we going to do? And he would do it, you know, at the time. And I not that Byron was himself. He did some stuff in the community, but he's kind of an eccentric fellow. But he gave me a lot of backing, and that was, you know, that's very important. I think it was very important at the time. I wasn't feeling like I was all out there by myself, you know, and then there were people. I mean, Peggy Goldberg has always been a kind of a. I used to call her the kitchen power. If you notice, she's still always in the kitchen. You know, so it's a wonderful quality she has. She's always in the kitchen, kind of standing at the counter, running Seattle. I mean, you know, Peggy is tremendous social, and she still does. You know, connections and power, which she, with her little printing press and the duck press and all that she did, and but she didn't want to run something up front. You know, that wasn't her skill or her interest. So it was fine for me. I mean, she was a big help and support, as I recall, good friend. And Alice Rooney was also, who was the longtime and very successful director of Allied Arts. And in fact, my biggest failure of my presidency was that Alice left in my second year. Oh my gosh, that was awful. And because, you know, so much of it was day-to-day stuff that she took care of, and we'd get on the phone every day when I was here and when I was and talk about issues, what needed to be done. And she was a real partner of mine. She didn't aspire to the kind of presidency, that kind of. She was happy to be the staff person, but she's very remarkable, as you know, and knows everything and was a good strategist. But she got a time to go to Washington, D.C. in a certain kind of fellowship of something, and that was hard. We had hard following her, and the worst thing is one of our fundraising debacles, and I want to finish on this, but I'll tell you, we tried to raise money by publishing and selling calendars called Flags, Banners, and Kites, which was a festival at the time that summer, and these were beautiful pictures. It was beautifully done. But we had no idea how to market anything, and no one was interested in that. And meanwhile, we'd spent all this money getting these things printed, and the person who was in Allied Arts who had pushed this whole idea, she was kind of a PR person, she went to Washington, D.C. that summer and left me, and I was in England that summer, actually, in London. And I got this phone call, this debacle was happening, and oh, it's just awful. And so we had this huge debt, and Jerry and I, Thone and I, who I'm very, very fond of, by the way. Jerry's just a wonderful person, and wonderful president, and a wonderful person. He and I had to go hat in hand to all of our creditors, debtors, and say we couldn't pay our bills, you know, because we couldn't sell these things. And so that was a kind of a terrible financial, I mean, that was just awful. That isn't certainly wasn't my strength, and it wasn't our strength at the time. You know, we weren't interested in doing that. We wanted to raise money, you know. There's so many more fun things to do than that. So that's about, can you remember anything else?
I was going to actually later on, but since we're on the subject, I was going to ask you about that time when Alice left, and there was some interesting correspondence that you and Alice had that are in the
are there?
Letters that you guys sent back and forth.
Oh, really?
Alice was very concerned about what was happening. Always happens.
Can you pick up the phone? Yeah.
We can stop it for a minute.
What was?
So there was some interesting correspondence between you and Alice was very concerned about what was happening, and you were reporting back to her what was happening.
Yeah. We were very concerned.
What it was like.
Well, you know, we not only didn't make any money out of that, we were in danger of going into further debt, you know, and we had to pay rent and pay Alice's salary, and, you know, there was a financial reality there that had, and, you know, we usually, you know, we had fundraisers, but we were, again, we never made the appeal to really heavy hitters in the way that now is done. And I'm not sure we would have done that. I don't know. We've never been that way. Even the foundation now, which is made up of former Allied Arts presidents and vice presidents and people that are active, we still don't raise money very much, you know. And even though there now more of us have money to give, that's just never been in our tradition, you know. It was a big worry, and it was, you know, it really. It kind of soured the whole thing. I mean, I'm not sour now. It was, but it was kind of a downer. Certainly, it was. And actually, what happened, as I recall, is that really we were forgiven our debt by a lot of the creditors, and thank goodness they did, the printers and people. So, you know, we didn't lose much money. We just didn't make any money either, and that's always been a problem, you know. But I don't think any of us would have done it any differently in terms of the financial expectations for its members. We've never made that be a requirement. You know, now if you want to be on the APRA board, it's understood that you have to, you know, you put in at least $7,500 to $10,000 a year. You pay to be on the board. Well, that's not how we ever wanted it, you know. So.
When you became president, were there some goals that you had that you wanted to accomplish?
You know, if there were, I can't think of any. I suppose, and I can't remember quite when the street tree thing. I've always cared about the street trees, and really the Save the Market, I think, had pretty much. Had we won that by that time? I can't remember. Yeah, I think I recall. You know, the notion of spending public money for art, 1% for art, all of that, municipal art, having art be on a committee, you know, but in city government and in county government and state government, that was all very new. And a lot of it was, we were doing it, we were some of the first people to do it in the city, you know. And I remember that we were often used as for a model. Other people would come out and study what we would do, you know. Our relationship with legislators. Joel Pritchard, who was a nice guy, he was a kind of mildly Republican, but as we used to have. He was, I remember he came to a meeting. We were sitting together on some kind of a box or something. We were raised high up and chatting, you know, and it was just, there was that kind of easiness that we had, and people, you know, it was a sense of, it was really, I don't know what would be a parallel that one might point to with this, but it was what did Peggy Goldberg used to call it, the best club in town or something like that, you know, and it was, there was probably a little bit of, you know, insiderism that went on and feeling about it, but we were always open to new people coming, you know. Anyone who had an idea could come to a meeting and talk, and you'll be, you know, it was always very lively, and keeping order at the meeting was always a bit of a challenge, but it was fun, you know. I think later on there was some attempt to try to have Allied Arts be a kind of a one-issue group for a while, and have a focus, you know. I don't know. I'm not sure that was the right move. The times were different, you know. As time went on, things got different, partly because the issues in some ways were more complex, and also that people just kind of burned out after a while, you know. This was a kind of we were burning with a hot gem-like flame, isn't what Walter Pater described it, you know. So it was a kind of, so inevitably, things changed a bit. And there were people in later who were more administratively interested, and there were more, more city kind of governmental issues, which can be kind of deadening, to tell you the truth,
What period would that be?
Well, I think it was more 80s and 90s, and it's kind of funny because our relation with Allied Arts of Seattle, the foundation, and of course the foundation is made up of the old people that I'm talking about who are now older, and it's like it's the equivalent of, professors in the 60s who now are teaching students, and the professors are now old, but they're more radical, a lot more radical than their students are. It's that kind of reversal. Well, that's kind of the same thing, I think, is that the Allied Arts Foundation people were always more radical, I think, than the later maybe people of the Allied Arts of Seattle people. So, and there's always it's funny, we really now pretty much disengaged with them for various reasons that are kind of sad. I always thought that was sad. I wasn't for that, but inevitably things change, so.
Back to you. Do we have something?
Or I'm gonna stop it right now.
We're just going to change to. Now, but going back to your first year as president in '76, you had an interesting team. It was you as president, and it was Jim Euler was
Yes.
your first vice president, and Judy Wetzel was your second vice president. Could you talk a little bit about that team?
Well, first of all, Jim Euler at the time was my brother-in-law, and Judy Wetzel, of course, she was, I think, the founding director of Poncho. She was also a housewife up on Capitol Hill, and our kids went to, she had two boys, and I had one, and I think her second one and mine went to preschool together. And so it was a personal connection as well. But actually, I think psychically that I was closer to the people who'd come before me in a way than I was to Jim. He did it 1 year. He was the first person I recall that only did it 1 year. I don't know why that was true. I kind of peeled off after that, as presidents do sometimes. I was tired, and plus all of a sudden I got that job at the university, and I got really engaged there. So I didn't track it as well, especially when Judy was president. Did she become president?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. No, I don't think she did either. I don't think so. So I think that the activist roles, the kind of, was really, I don't know, maybe you could say it ended with me. I don't want to overshoot this. When did Paul Silver become president? He became president, do you remember?
Shortly after you.
Maybe after Jim.
After
Jim left, yeah, I remember that.
He was 79, 80.
Yeah, I remember working with Paul Silver some. And he, as I recall, he was pretty on track. I would probably point to his presidency as being a strong one.
Is Paul still around? Paul Silver?
He is, that I've last seen. He's not been active at all in the foundation. We tried to get him several times to get in, and he didn't. I don't know why. He's a very nice person. I like him a lot. Lawyer, kind of quiet, but has not been. I don't know. He's probably had some other interests in family. You know how that is. But he's not been active in the foundation at all. We've added people to the foundation mainly just to keep our numbers up, and some new people. And Rena, now our president, was, she came much later. I don't even know if she had anything to do with Allied Arts of Seattle. But so the foundation, of course, has taken on kind of a life of its own. Not a terribly active life, but a life of its own. But nothing like the kind of raucous days of, and it shouldn't be, the foundation can't be political and still keep its tax status. But I'm sure what everyone refers to as a kind of heyday of Allied Arts were probably just about from a little bit after me to maybe Fred Bassetti and before a little bit. Ibsen was president at some earlier point, yeah, he would have been. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those guys were very smart and very good, very dedicated, And you know, it wasn't a particularly democratic organization. I don't know what you'd call it, maybe libertarian or something, as opposed to, you know, it was, people came because of their talent and their drive, and whoever had, you know, a really good idea, or really wanted to, and could convince us that this was a really important thing, that's how we kind of went. So it was kind of advocacy, and so we kind of, our agenda was almost, I mean, it wasn't a planned agenda in many ways. I don't think most presidents had a really planned agenda, you know. There were always things going on that you wanted to pick up and carry on with, but that's how it struck me more. You know, when it was kind of like stuff would hit you, and, you know, something else would hit you. So you had to stay open to stuff. And that's not uncommon, you know. Because the most interesting things were things that came up, you know, and then we acted on them, rather than, well, this year we're going to do this, this, and this, you know. I'm on a couple boards right now, and they do that, and it just bores me silly, you know, because it seems to me that is, I know that you need to do it differently, especially if you're an advisory board. But see, we weren't an advisory board, we were it. That's all we were. There was nothing else but us. It wasn't like we had a separate museum or an opera or something else to support. We were the whole thing. And that's very different from, well, lots of other organizations. I don't quite know if there's anything quite like that now, but.
It seems like people keep having trouble really defining what Allied Arts was. You know what I mean? But,
Yeah, well,
but
it was an advocacy, yes, an activist group. I mean, they went beyond just advocating. They actually, you know, went to the streets and did the work and sat in the committees and raised the money for projects. Like raising money for saving the market was a lot easier for us, and then raising money for our own group. You know what I mean? By that, it was there was a sense of that. Raising money for street trees, and yeah, that's really what it was.
No. One of the things that you did when you came into office was focus on kind of doing a little restructuring with committees. And one of the things that was stated in 1976 was that there was a kind of rethinking of the committee structure for Allied Arts, and moving a little bit more towards ad hoc committees that could work for a short time and then,
Yes.
and then
Yeah, I kind of remember that. Yeah, I do remember that a little bit. Yeah.
Long-standing
Yes.
committees, so you
Yeah.
can be more flexible.
Yes.
And that
yes,
kind of goes
yeah.
along with
Absolutely. Yeah. Long-term committees. I mean, again, that says something like the Ways and Means Committee that, you know, the Senate and Congress has. We don't know what's going to happen, so we stayed. Yeah, the best ones were, oh, let's form a committee to look into this, and anyone who's cared about could run and join that committee and do it. Yes.
And then end.
And then it would end. Yeah, when the issue was somehow resolved, it would end, and which I think is, given the thing, it was much better to do it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a statement that was made that was, we can, if the committees meet and decide that there's nothing for them to do, a committee may very well vote itself out of existence.
Right, which is a very great thing. Right. Yeah, we didn't exist to go to committee meetings, you know. But I don't know if anyone has told you this, but where we had our offices at the time, which was up in the, I think Jones and Jones, were very generous and gave us a very low rate or no rate rent, and we'd troop up to the second or third floor down in Pioneer Square, and it would be, it was a bigger room than this, but it would, and higher ceilings. I mean, we'd have meetings that would be packed to the gills, you know, just packed, and it was very exciting. I've never seen meetings like that since here in Seattle. You know, there were, it was just the place to be, you know.
What kind of people were at those meetings?
Well, there was a kind of, some of the people I've described, and then sometimes there were the kind of passerbyers, you know, and not literally, but people who would, well, what's this all about, you know, and kind of stumble in and stumble back out again, so to speak. So there were people that went through there, kind of like minnows going through the nets, you know, and then other people would come and stay. And I think for people that were really, it didn't appeal to everyone. and people liked order and organization and status of a certain kind, that you might get a different kind of board. This wasn't that kind of thing. It wasn't. And I think it took a certain amount of, there was a lot of joie de vivre, a lot of fun, a lot of laughter, a lot of funniness. But it was people that are pretty self-confident, I would suspect, yeah. If you were real shy or uncertain about yourself, it probably wasn't the right kind of place, Although I think, I shouldn't say that, there were a lot of people probably who were more kind of at the back of the room, who listened, who didn't talk, and then there were a lot of people who talked a lot. As always, that's true. But who came and out of interest and who would come to meetings and events and who liked to be, if someone would, I think we're coming to town or moving to Seattle and say, they would be a group they might hear about that they might want to, go to. And some would stay for a while and some would, but I think there was a certain group of stalwarts that were, and usually they came with professional success of some kind or another. They brought some expertise to the group. Not just, I want to do something for the city of Seattle kind of thing. I mean, they were already professionals who had reached, I think, a success of their own. And so they gave them certain confidence, and they already had some name recognition. I don't think I did, but that's how that happened, I think. And so it was probably a fairly intimidating group, come to think of it.
And probably pretty strong when it came to people in power.
Yes. I mean, the mayors, oh God, what's Seattle like? I just think about this. They would, they want to talk to me. I'm sure we were kind of a pain in the neck to some of the administrators, which was great, of course.
You had a pretty good relationship when you were president with Wes Ullman.
I did. I did.
And people seem to point to him as being a pretty good mayor.
He was a good mayor. He wasn't terribly, now I'm going to, he wasn't like, he was a kind of a, if I can say, a typical Democratic, mayor and who wanted to do the right thing. But his whole, saving the market thing, he wasn't for that. He got turned around on that. But he was a quick study, I think, and he learned, like he did about the zoo, that there were some better ideas out there than, just there was a lot of urban renewal money going on, and so a lot of things like tearing down the market was an obvious one that he wanted to do, and for good reason, but except that not understanding really historic preservation and all of that. That was very new at the time, But he did learn, yes, he did. He was a very different from I don't know our current mayor. He's probably the first mayor I have not had anything to do with, but I don't think you connect our current mayor with the arts or anything. I don't think that's where he was. Whereas I think Wes really got into it, and he did, and made himself available and accessible to people. And I think that's how Paul got his start, probably through Wes Ullman, and Paul went along and did a lot of good, things. It's interesting. I really don't know what happened to Paul's mayor term quite, but he certainly was very successful before then. I think as an advocate, maybe he was very dedicated, very hardworking, very thoughtful kind of person. Not a glad-hander at all, which may have cramped his style a bit as mayor, but he was very good otherwise, I thought.
Another thing that people constantly talk about as we interview them is the great parties that Allied Art used to have, and you've alluded to that a bit, and I'm just wondering if you could talk about that with this joie de vivre that
I can't remember the specific ones, except maybe if you can remind me some of them. We had some at our house, as a matter of fact. When our big house was a great place to have parties, and we always have parties kind of on a shoestring, which was, there was be drinks and a punch in a tub or something, kind of along that ilk. And we tried to have parties, as I recall, in kind of interesting places, that we wanted people to know about. and tried to have meetings there too. We didn't always have the meetings in our offices, but you're right. The parties were always a part of the fun, and it was. I can't remember a particular one beyond the one I described earlier. I guess there was, and again, it was the place to be. It was a group that you'd want to try to be with. I think there was a certain amount of that. I don't want to go too far in all that, but we weren't a group of people that were very interested in or that were also sought out by people who were socially prominent, who wanted to be socially prominent. I think I would say, without naming any names, there were people who came into Allied Arts who wanted to kind of climb the social ladder, and they thought this might get them where they wanted to be in Seattle. And I think they fairly quickly discovered that wasn't going to work. This wasn't that kind of an organization, If anything, it was kind of anti the establishment at times. So if you wanted to become part of Seattle's finest, you didn't, citizens, in the social scene, you wouldn't. This isn't where you would find it.
But politically, would that be? It could be a stepping stone politically, yes.
Yes, I think politically it could be. Of course, look what happened to Victor's son, Steinbrück. Peter, of course, has become very successful politically, and. But yes, other people. I can't think of who else maybe went on besides Paul to political office directly.
Margaret Pagler was.
Yes, Margaret. Yes, Margaret. Yeah. I remember I was a little peeved at Margaret for stepping down early from her presidency to run for office or something. And I remember saying to her, that she should have felt, I was kind of schoolmarmish about it. But at any rate, yes, she did. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people that was their entrance into, and a lot of people were on boards, city boards, like the market board. And I don't think my zoo thing came out of that. I think it was kind of the opposite. The zoo thing was just kind of, again, a serendipitous kind of thing, but yeah. And then, you could use Allied Arts. That's one thing that happened, is someone would get interested in something, some issue, like some of the ones I mentioned just personally. And then if you were used with Allied Arts, you could go there and say, hey, what are we going to do about this? And so it was a great conduit for activity, yes. And again, if the organization had too much of set goals, there wouldn't have been room or enthusiasm for these things coming to us out of the left field, which is often where they came, And so the group stayed very flexible. I think that was the key to its success at the time. It was always open to new ideas, always flexible. And that's why I think these committees that were just started up shut down when it was, when the issues were there to be dealt with. That was part of its success, I think.
The next thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So at times there were several. There'd be 5, 6 things going on at once, and so it was always something new. But again, it was not a place, I think, for people who wanted to become socially prominent, because it wasn't particularly safe that way. You could step on toes to get stuff done, and we were willing to. Most of the architects had their own firms. They were already established. They didn't have to, kowtow to their big firm or something. Worry about making partner. Those kinds of, and I think one of the things that lots of people I know, professors, lawyers, doctors, all have that are my age now and older, harken back to the time of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in which the corporate demands and the corporate structure wasn't so heavy, Billable hours now was just, lawyers just kills people. They don't have time for that now. They wouldn't have time for that activism, And at the time, even if they were in a firm like Cooley Perkins or whatever, some other big firm, Bogle and Gates, that was part of the fun of it. They weren't kept back from doing that, and It wasn't just pro bono work, go out and do good. It was more than that, And I'm sure their firms must have taken some heat sometimes from some of their other clients, But I think a lot of them were willing to do that. So.
Yeah, Paul Schell talked a little bit about
Did he? Yes, I can imagine.
being the only Democrat.
I can imagine. Yes, absolutely. I can just imagine. I didn't have that kind of a problem, really, luckily, at the university. And it helped by being at the even at the university when I was teaching, as I had more flexible time, as you do, professor. But so I can't think of much else to say.
Well, in terms of accomplishments, there are a couple of things that maybe you can comment on. One was Crafts Week, which was something that got established during your time in office.
Was it really? I don't remind me about Crafts Week.
With stores that were featuring crafts in various parts of the city, and
oh yeah,
lots of workshops and
yes,
displays. And
was Mickey Guston part of that? I know Mickey was a really wonderful person who actually died a couple years ago. She was down in California, but Mickey was a good friend of Alice Rooney's and was a crafts person, and she may have been, as I recall, more part of that and making that thing go. Yeah. Allied Arts had several themes, maybe not, as I said, we did have, the issues were different and would change. One of them was always an aesthetic issue, and the crafts one would be an example of that. And I think the architects, saving buildings, and or preserving buildings and interest in. We have some wonderful downtown buildings that are Art Deco inside, and making sure they didn't get torn down or covered over, so there was the architectural, aesthetic, artistic part of it all, and then there was just the kind of. It wasn't politics for politics' sake, because it was, we had probably some Republicans in there, probably not as many as Democrats, but it never was. That was not talked about per se. It wasn't that kind of a group, but certainly was involved with city government on issues, political issues, where you had to go and be an advocate, and where votes like the zoo vote, the market vote, all that kind of stuff was. And then there was urban preservation, urban planning, so which really was in governmental kinds of things. And then working for 1% for Art, which joined those two things, art and government, and politics. So those were strands that ran through us. I think there were times when some of the art was really lost. I think there just weren't people there who understood the importance of the aesthetics, that were kind of grinding away on city issues, that were, and I think that I think those three strands were important to keep going. And I don't think we thought about it particularly at the time, but that was always true. We didn't just become concerned about bureaucracy, which can be so deadening, if you sit on those committees. But, we'd spin off things oftentimes, like the market, 1% for Art, the Zoo Committee. A lot of these were spun off and taken into city government, And there were people who were involved in Allied Arts who went off and became head of those committees in city government. And Alice Rooney's a better remembrance of a lot of those people than I do. But I think Miss Guston was an example of that. Of course, Paul Schell was an example of that. People who actually got jobs in city government, Ray Tufts, I don't know where she was. I think she was working pretty much for the park department by that time most of the time. Yeah, I think she was. But so there was certainly a close connection between government and Allied Arts, but we kept ourselves pretty separated when we needed to. We kept our skirts clean, so to speak, so that we could be advocates, and we didn't say, we can't say that. We never allowed that to happen,
You sponsored when you were president. You sponsored a lot of under the aegis of Allied Arts, sponsored a bunch of things art-related, such as a program called Plazas for the People, and another program called Art and Public Spaces, and another program called The Future of Seattle's Past, which was a lecture series. And all three of them were sponsored by Allied Arts in cooperation with some other groups. So was that something that you were very concerned about as well, making sure that Allied Arts was involved in the city?
Well, yeah, I did. I do. I mean, a lot of them I remember because really I was not. In many cases, these were done by people who wanted to do this, and we would provide the right kind of leadership, support, not leadership. They would take the leadership, and we'd provide the support and strategy, and name, to do that. Yeah. So we spawned an awful lot of things, which nowadays some of the organizations that we spawn don't even recognize that or know that. That's okay, You don't have to get credit for everything, but that was certainly true. That's why the history of Allied Arts is so important here, Jeff, because it does deserve its own story, that you're going to do. And we've felt this for a long time, that it was unique, and there's something I think that always to learn from this. I mean, it's really one of the successful things. I wouldn't exactly connect it to the Bloomsbury group in London or, but that once in a while a group of people come together and do some very interesting things, and you can't predict when that's going to happen or how long. And by the way, the fact that I think it's still not going on at the pace that it was or in the shape it was doesn't mean anything, because a lot of the great things just have their time and then end, So I think it was, or at least end as it was. I think that, and I think that was true about it. I really do. I want to wax sentimental, but it's a story worth telling.
There were a couple of things that happened during your presidency that were kind of lighter. A couple of lighter moments that I wanted to
All right,
share.
if I can remember.
And it's kind of amusing to find in the archives. One was both of them happened in '76, which was the first year of your presidency. One was being invited to join the Chowder Society by Blair Butterworth of the UW, and this was a society that included Paul Schell, Pepper Schwartz, Fred Bassetti, Peggy Goldberg, Ibsen Nelson, and Victor Steinbrück. And I'm wondering what was the Chowder Society, if you remember?
Well, I wasn't asked actually to belong to the Chowder Society. I remember the time thinking, well, okay.
Actually, there was something that said you were invited.
Oh, was it? I didn't think I was invited. Maybe it was later after, but I remember they were starting it. I'll tell you what I think it was, and those were the key, is that I think that there was some sense, and Ibsen was really, I think, behind that, and that, we wanted to kind of start anew something, So it was effort to kind of maybe recapture some of the earlier, but it never really went anywhere.
Was it like a meeting group?
Yeah, kind of.
Discussion?
Yeah, I think it was. But it never really took off in any important way. It didn't last too long, as I recall, either, But, there was a certain elitism, and I would say that's an example of it. I'd have to say personally, just about myself, I probably have a real, I don't know what the word would be. For want of a better word right now, small d democratic bone. I don't like elitism very much. And the thing I liked about Allied Arts is that it was you kind of, you could be asked to join, but you could ask yourself to join too. It was always a lot of fresh water flowing in, and it didn't have now. So I never liked things that smacked of even though, and maybe because I was a sorority. I belonged to a sorority, much to my chagrin, but I did. I was Rush chairman at our sorority for the University of Wisconsin. In fact, my senior year, I was chair of the whole Rush program, So, but maybe that's what turned me. I don't, I didn't kind of like that. I kind of liked the, I was always public school person. I went to public universities, you know. So I like public, open. And maybe it's just the idea of it, and I know not everyone could or would join Allied Arts, but I like the idea that they could, you know, and it wasn't a closed system, you know. It wasn't an exclusive group like that, you know, like the Rainier Club or the College Club or the University Women's Club, or none of which have I ever joined or been asked to join, for all I know, as I recall, you know. Yeah, I'm not Sunset Club. That's not me.
Another thing that came up was the certificate that was presented to you by the Seattle Aquarium, which was
God, I don't remember that. Was there?
Signed by Wes Elliman. Wes Elliman presented it to you.
I don't remember that.
The
Not
Parks
terrible.
Department and also the Seattle Aquarium,
Don't
and they named you honorary barnacle on behalf of the hull of the Seattle Aquarium. I guess this was for some good works. That
God, I don't remember that. Is that right?
But it was just
The honorary barnacle. Oh, that's great.
on behalf of the hull of the Seattle Aquarium.
The hull, which had all the barnacles on it, I suppose. Oh, wasn't that funny? You know, James Joyce's wife was Nora Barnacle. Isn't that a wonderful name? She's kind of crazy, but she's Irish. Oh, maybe that was why I got. I don't know. I don't remember that, but that is funny. Yeah, there was lots of fun. As I said, we should show my T-shirt. That they gave me at some. I don't know when I retired or something. But did you see this?
Oh,
Put the T-shirt on the. I should hold it up or something, but.
Definitely a still photo of that one.
Yeah, we'll get it.
All right, you get it some other time. All right,
And
good.
no, we'll do it a little bit later.
Well, you've taken up a lot of your time. You have to leave pretty soon, mate? Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about Betty Bowen, because she passed during your time in office, and she was a very active member as well, I believe, of LA.
When did you say she died?
I think it was 77.
Was she died that early? Really? Well, gosh. Betty was not a really active personality at arts. She was connected with the art museum. And that was her real, again, she, I think her real allegiance was there, and her, what should I say, her kind of public identity was there. And so I knew her not well. I remember one time she rolled up in some, probably rolls or something. She was quite someone, and stylish and beautiful woman, and imperious. And she came up to my front door at our old house, my house, and kind of. And as I said, I knew her, but I didn't know her very well, and kind of said, well, what are you going to do about this? And and I don't even remember what the issue was, but she was her own kind of grande dame. She didn't really work with the group that much. That was my inclination. She didn't. I mean, she was friends with lots of different people, and of course there is a Betty Bowen Award, that they do, and Peggy Goldberg's on that, Tom Wilson's on that. Which is very good, and she was very much an art person, and but she has her own real history in her own area, sphere of influence, which only, as I recall, touched on Allied. I don't think, for example, Betty Bowen worked on the market or in street trees. That wouldn't have been her, her style as much. Yeah. So interesting woman, by the way. Yeah, very interesting person. And I don't know.
Are there some people or specific memories that you would want to share? People that you would consider to be some of your favorites from Allied Arts or events?
Well, I think I've kind of shot through almost most of my memories, Jeff. You'll have to find out about our annual meeting where I told you about Bob Goldberg, who was Peggy's former husband at the time, but he made a funny comment, like he said, I think they thought we were coming tomorrow night rather than tonight, to this restaurant that was unprepared, and, we had to run around, and as I said, buy rot-gut wine, to try and find them down in the Pioneer Scheme. It was very funny and very typical, we came and there was no food, nothing to eat, but everyone had a great time. And I don't know if I guess we got finally something to eat, but those are the kinds of funny things that happened. Planning for that kind of stuff was never quite what we were as interested in, and so it was. They always were somewhat surprising, and if they came off at all, really. But I guess my fond memories are just generally thinking about the meetings, and that there was a kind of fission that went on, a kind of electricity that went through there, when we were going to have a meeting, and lots of behind-the-scenes stuff beforehand, and calling and strategizing about what we're going to do about this, what we're going to do about that, and it was, you felt that you were, and a lot of people did, not just me, and not just when I was president, but that you were kind of connected with something kind of really important or significant, and it was fun, it was fun, and if it wasn't fun, then but I think it always, even when it was hard, there were times it was very hard, we had some really tough times, and some tough arguments amongst ourselves about how to do things. I remember one, Victor Steinberg, I was in my office at the university, and Victor, who was a wonderful person, but God, he laid me out on something just flat. I forgot what it was. I didn't do quite what he wanted me to do. And wow, did I get it, from him. And then I remember another time, it was, what was his name? He was a Native American who was head of the Starbreak Center, something like that. Daybreak Center, yeah. Nice fellow, and I don't know what either. Same thing. Boy, did I get laid out on a phone call, and I had no idea. Kind of like, but somehow I was the point person that was somehow we didn't do something right, and so there was a lot of things to kind of keep your eye on, and that's why someone like Alice was so invaluable to me, and I really used her as a partner. I hope the earlier and later presidents were smart enough to do that. Alice was she'd pretty much started to work her way out of Allied Arts by that time, and she came back, and then she went on to Pilchuck, I think, and some other things. So she had a further career, but she kind of was Allied Arts for a long time. The presidents could come and go, but Alice was there, and she knew the issues and had a great memory and knew everyone, and so she was just superb to work with. She was, as far as a woman was concerned, president, she was great. She was never, there's sometimes, unfortunately, some women that don't like to work for other women, and that was never the case with Alice. And I was younger than she was. We had a wonderful time, though. And as I said, getting ready for those meetings was always, there was always wine going around for those meetings, and so they were always, a bit, if there's anything else, but they were always kind of added to the fuel of the whole thing. So it was, and Robert's rules were tested quite a few times at those places, I think. It was nerve-wracking. I was challenged, Being chair of the faculty senate was easy squeezy compared to that time. It was good. Now, I never made those connections before, but it was true, you were on a hot seat there. You had to, if you didn't do it right, or someone didn't think you were on the right side of something or something, you'd hear about it.
Well, that really points to the importance of the organization.
Yes, yeah.
People took you seriously.
Yes, they did, yeah. And our own members took us seriously, and if we didn't, like Victor and, gosh, what was his name? I'm not sure he actually was the Native American fellow who was the founder of the Daybreak Center, but I had done something right. I didn't even remember what the issue was, but I'm not sure had anything to do with it, but nevertheless, I got called on it.
Could you speak for just a minute about this? You mentioned the Seattle Commons before, and I'm just curious to hear that.
Well, that came later, and I was not involved or watching as carefully, but that was, there was a plan, the Seattle Commons, this was, 10, 15 years ago, maybe now, to make a greensward all the way from downtown to South Lake Union. That whole area would be open for green like they have in London, or is the whole, big park to join one part of this. And, there was a lot of, obviously, people who had buildings there who didn't want to, it would be a big city, it would be a disruption, big urban change and disruption. But there was a chance to do that. I mean, how many chances do you have that were very realistic to open up, a city like that and make it, this big park like that? I mean, as I said, London, you certainly point to Paris for having these big open green spaces and in the middle of the city. And I can't remember exactly, and you'll have to verify this from someone else, but my recollection is the Allied Arts of Seattle waffled on that. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, wow, you really did. They didn't kind of do anything in the end. They didn't, here was the most important thing, as I recall, that was going on at the time. This was sometime later, maybe 90s, would we say? Maybe early 90s. And they didn't, they couldn't agree on it or something, so they didn't do anything. And I thought, wow, that's, they've lost a real chance here to be an activist group. It was a really important thing, and they didn't.
Was that Fred's part of? Was that part of Fred's? Was Fred part of that? Fred Bassetti, was he part of that?
Oh, I don't think so. Was he? He was much. Was he part of? We mean.
The planning, the concept of the.
He as an architect, he may have been. Yeah. He may have well been. I really don't remember. I don't know that. As I said, I was pretty busy in my own career by that time, and so I didn't keep up as much. But it was a great idea, I thought, and like I personally think the tunnel's a great idea. I think that we have a chance finally to get rid of that monstrosity, and not put up another one. And I think it's wonderful to have an opportunity to sink the traffic and have a really wonderful waterfront in Seattle. A chance in a lifetime, We put up in my lifetime, put up another viaduct, and, so these opportunities don't come along very much, like saving the market. You have to act fast, and you can't waffle, and you can't, once you make up your mind of your position, you have to go for it. Because a lot of these things will be gone then, so, and can't be redone. Interesting enough, a lot of the great city like New York and Paris, somewhat London, were done by, especially Paris and you think New York, by not by a very democratic process. They were done like Robert Moses in New York. Hauptmann, wasn't he? Worked for Napoleon. That did urban renewal by just, we're going to do this by fiat. And, there's something to say about that. And I think Allied Arts was not an individual, but we did have that, that sense that here's an opportunity, we have to do it, or else we won't want to committee something to that. Look how long it took us to get some kind of rapid transit here, because we didn't have that kind of a leadership, on that issue. And you really need to. Otherwise, you squander an awful lot of opportunities. And I think the Commons was a squandered opportunity. I felt it was. So that's just a personal opinion. And I was disappointed that Allied Arts of Seattle did not take a more active stance on it. And that's what I don't think they were against it. They just weren't for. They just kind of, I don't remember what the internal discussions were, but my impression was they dithered and nothing happened. So.
Well, I'm gonna take you back for just a second to the end of your presidency, and this is the statement that you made on your farewell speech.
Oh my goodness!
I'll just get you.
I don't remember that a bit.
You said Allied Arts is frequently described as a bunch of talkers. Well, we are. We do other things, of course, write, organize, lobby, put on festivals, parties, crafts weeks, sponsor debates, sell. But we do talk. As well we should. Much of what goes on that's good in Seattle occurs because people have been convinced, cajoled, humored, irritated by us into accepting the best answer. And that's what's important, because the best answer, once we've agreed among ourselves, is rarely the easiest, cheapest, least controversial answer, especially in the beginning. the market, the freeways, 1% art, the viaduct, the parking lots, historic and urban conservation, landmarks preservation ordinance, Westlake, the Space Needle. These needed and still need talk. All involve issues that can never be settled once and for all, much as we'd like to at times. Conditions change, council members and department heads change, mayors change, and the talk starts again. Our words don't fall on deaf ears, we are listened to.
Wow, that was really quite good. That was quite good. Wow. I don't remember a word of that I wrote, but yeah. That's kind of what I was saying again, wasn't it, in a way? Yeah.
But yeah, that was a very nice way to kind of end your time with that.
Yes, it was.
Just a couple of just wanted to get a couple of updates from you about the kinds of things that you're involved in now. What kind of work and activities do you do outside of the arts?
Well, I retired from the university as a full professor in gosh, I don't remember what it was, 7 years ago. And then I went on what we call a 40% time, which means option part-time for 5 years. And now I'm through with that. So, of course, that's freed up some time. And thinking, I have joined 2 boards. One is at the Burke Museum, which is the Natural History Museum. It's the oldest museum in the state of Washington. And I like that. I like the museum. I like what it does. And growing up near Chicago, I always went to the Natural History Museum in Chicago, which is the big museum. So I have a fond history of that. Then I also, one of the best things I did, which had with Ann Hallberg started actually, was that it started in a very small way. She had an idea of wanting to do a brochure for Tom Wilson of his portraits so that he could sell more portraits or something. Ann and Tom Wilson are good friends over the years. So she gathered people together, as Annie can do, because she's got a lot of clout, and I was one who was called in, and I felt that all of a sudden, the idea of doing a book on Tom Wilson just seemed perfect, and for lots of reasons, Tom didn't ever have a gallery or an agent, and so his work is what I called in the preface of the book, which he ended up writing, he's the best known unknown painter in Seattle. And so lots of us had his paintings in very fancy and not so fancy homes. But he didn't have, his body of work kind of collected. So in the short, I got involved in, and it turned out to be fabulously, wonderfully successful, publishing a book with the University of Washington Press on Tom Wilson. And out of that grew the Tom Wilson Fund project, which is to do work on painters, artists who in the Northwest, they don't have to be from the Northwest, in the Northwest, whose work deserves a wider audience. That's a kind of thing. And then we've done a second book on Joe Goldberg, which I was showing you earlier, Peggy Goldberg's nephew by marriage. And we're now kind of rustling around for a third project, and in part because of that, I've been asked to join the University of Washington Press Board, which is an advisory board, and that's very pleasing to me as a old professor. And I am on those 2 boards, plus Allied Arts of the foundation, and we have a wonderful president right now, Rena, who's very organized, and I feel we kind of passed the presidency around from Jerry to me to Lou, and but we're getting kind of exhausted a little bit on those, so it's nice to have some new blood in there too as well. So that's what I'm doing, and actually I've been thinking about a book project of my own, which maybe shall remain nameless right now, but that I'd like to, because I'm finally kind of freed up, and. This might be I don't know if it'd be something I might do with the press. I'll see, how it works out. But I would love to do something to give the press money. I like the University of Washington Press very much, and it's very, very, like most presses are, hard-pressed for money these days. And these tangential groups like Burke, the press, Henry Gallery, they're all, out there, and the university core is what's, of course, at stake because of the budget. So they do need to raise money, and it would be fun to do that. But it's a great group of people. So those are the things that I'm doing, Jeff. And then I don't know, I have my cabin that I go to in the summer, and I have a son and with a granddaughter, daughter-in-law, and that's fun. And I have my two sisters, are both here now. My older sister started and was director of a school until a few years ago called the Valley School. It's a wonderful school down in Madison Valley, preschool through 5th grade. And my younger sister, Jim Mueller's former wife, Jane Mueller, is a extremely successful MD doctor at Swedish Hospital. She's been one of those top docs. She runs circles around me, and was chief of staff there, and now has quit her clinical practice, and she's overseeing. And she has kind of the portfolio of OB/GYN, neonatal, and pediatrics at Swedish. So that's my sister Jane. So we have a family of the girls.
It's nice to have them all here.
It's wonderful, and we have my older sister's older daughter is in the Foreign Service. She just got back from Afghanistan. Her son he's an environmental lawyer, prosecuting, actually in the Justice Department, but prosecutes environmental criminals. And then Jane has 2 boys who are kind of internet guys here in Seattle. So that's how And my son, John, is kind of in a political world too. He worked for He worked for Max Baucus 1 year out of college, and then worked for John Kitzhaber in Oregon, the governor, for 8 years in the press office, and has done several jobs since. But so it's kind of in our blood.
Yeah. Well, that's a great way to end.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.